Let me start by saying that I think many of your outlets heard me say prior to the election that I was optimistic that a deal would be struck to avert the effects of the fiscal cliff. And I continue to feel that way. In fact, I feel slightly more that way now than I did before the election for a couple of reasons. One, I think that the president's reelection and the fact that he is now not running ever again frees him up in some ways that perhaps were not true in his first term. Many of you know that I was a little worried about, politically speaking, what a newly elected President Romney would, whether he wouldn't be a bit more constrained by his right wing, which is, of course, always a group of people with whom he had a problem. So I actually think that I'm a little more optimistic now than I was even before the election about the prospects for a big deal. Also, of course, we heard a very conciliatory tone from the congressional leaders. I watched John Boehner's various speeches. He very explicitly put tax revenue increases on the table, which was new for him. The rest of the leadership has been, I think, equally conciliatory in the language they've used in describing what they want to achieve in the next couple of weeks. As you know, the president met with the 4 congressional leaders on Thursday of last week, and they emerged from that meeting, I think, also optimistic about the prospects for reaching an agreement. There is still ample opportunity for failure. I don't think it's likely, but the topics are both very complicated. How you reform Medicare in an equitable and fair and smart way is a huge and difficult conversation. The probability is, since a true Medicare reform requires a reform of the, even an incremental reform of the underlying healthcare delivery system, that what is likely to have to come out of this deal is something that is more top line, saying that, Medicare costs will be capped one way or another off into the future. And, people have different ideas of capping it, to GDP growth, to inflation. In order not to get too much into the weeds, the idea would be, let's agree to cap expenditures for government health care, and over time we will figure out all of the very complicated mechanisms to keep people healthier, to try to develop a healthcare delivery model that isn't about doing lots of stuff, it's about doing the good stuff, all of those things. And that's an uncomfortable discussion because, there's no guarantee that the underlying reform will get done if you do it that way. The tax code, of course, is an unbelievably complex beast, and reforming it is not a simple thing, both as a technical matter, but also because there isn't a loophole in the tax code that doesn't have a fairly powerful constituent, one way or another, to advocate on behalf of that loophole. On one end of the spectrum are the tax breaks for oil companies that everybody likes to hold up as something that isn't as crazy, but there is also the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is important to an awful lot of Americans. So that's a very complicated discussion, both technically as well as politically. So what I think this looks like, the way I think this plays out is that there are negotiations in the lame duck Congress. The new Congress is sworn in on January 3rd of next year, but there are negotiations prior to January 3rd to agree on a overall structure. In other words, top-line numbers for cuts, as well as top-line numbers for new revenue, and perhaps some big ideas for the reform of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. If that overall package is conceptually agreed to, what Congress could do is move the automatic spending cuts and tax increases that are scheduled to hit in a 24-hour period around New Year's Eve out a couple of months to give the committees of jurisdiction time to put flesh on the bones of the conceptual agreement. And that's wise for 2 reasons. One, you want something that technical to be worked out in places like the Ways and Means Committee. And number 2, there's an awful lot of very senior members of Congress who are going to want to feel like they had a say, and therefore, you want the deal to ultimately be negotiated in both the House and the Senate. So I think that's by far the most likely outcome. I do think that there's room for some gamesmanship around the very end of the year. In the 4 years that I've been in the Congress, deals have gotten done at the last minute. And the last minute in this case is sort of interesting because, to illustrate this, why it's interesting, today, I'll give you one example. Today, the top marginal income tax rate is 35%. If it expires, it's 39.6%. So let's just imagine the deal that's on the table is for the top marginal, and I'm making this up, I'm not saying this is going to be part of the deal, I'm just using this to illustrate why the end of the year gets kind of complicated. If the deal is that the top marginal income tax rate is going to be 37%, on December 31st, if you vote for that or if you agree to that, it's a tax hike. On New Year's Day, 24 hours later, if you agree to that, it's a tax decrease. So you've got some funky gamesmanship that could occur around the end of the year. So I do think that there's some chance for politics and gamesmanship and whatnot around that date. But at the end of the day, I do think that, getting past that, we have the outlines of a deal and a process to get to that deal, which I think is very important. Look, it's important. There's a lot of political discussion about, is the deficit the number one issue right now, or is it jobs, or what? The fact is that the deficit and our debt are serious issues, and we should deal with them sooner rather than later. That doesn't mean we should deal with them at the expense of investment in our infrastructure, investment in education, but it means that we should deal with it sooner rather than later. It's also, by the way, I really do believe that if we could get a big deal done, it would be hugely stimulative to the economy. There's a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines as people ask corporations ask the question, what's my tax rate next year? There's a lot of uncertainty out there. I think that argument can be overblown, but I think that there's something to it. And so I just think the fact of getting a deal done, I haven't looked at the stock market later today, but this morning it opened, high on, I think, the expectations that things were moving towards a deal. So from the near-term standpoint of the economy getting a little bit of a boost, I think that the scenario I described would be very positive for the American economy. So let me pause there and let you guys steer the conversation in any direction that's interesting to you.
Well, I think obviously the whole basis is the idea of the fiscal cliff. Is that an accurate term, or is that one of those overly demonstrative terms that doesn't really? There's no looming disaster, is there?
Unfortunately, it's really, you ask a very good question, because no, it's not a good term. And in fact, I think, Chairman Bernanke, who's not given to, colorful use of language, is the one who coined that term, and I think it probably did us a disservice. And in fact, subsequently, some economists have said it's not really a fiscal cliff, meaning if you go over it on January 2nd, you're dead. In fact, it's more like a fiscal ramp. If you don't deal with it, you start to go downhill and you pick up speed over time because, from an economic standpoint. Because the reality is that raising people's taxes or these spending cuts, they don't hammer the economy on January 2nd. They begin to take effect and they pick up steam as time goes by. And unfortunately, what has happened now is that, at some point in politics, perception sort of becomes reality. So now the fiscal cliff, and if we don't have a deal by December 31st, this would be a terrible thing because we've thought of it as a cliff. If it instead had been a less colorful metaphor of a fiscal ramp, it might have given us a little bit more time. On the other hand, it might have also taken away some of the urgency that the body in which I serve needs to get anything done on. So your question is very apt. But because of the perception, I think it's something that we should consider as a milestone beyond which we don't want to tread too far.
And you talked before about, how after January 1st it's a tax decrease and a tax increase. Anything that happens after January 2nd, that can be retroactively applied. That's a lot of reasoning when people say, well, it's not the end of the world if we go past the time frame here. These tax cuts can be once again retroactively applied.
Yeah. So in other words, if a deal were arrived at the end of January, sure. The reality that the federal agencies that would be affected by the automatic cuts could manage around that. They don't necessarily need to, cut their budgets on January 1st, and the tax code can be dealt with retroactively. That's just no way to run a railroad. In a perfect world, we would get this done well before December 31st so that we're not even playing with people's perceptions of, well, what really matters when? And, it's a little bit like the debt ceiling. We had a debt ceiling, deadline, and then it turns out that the government can manage its cash flow so that the deadline's actually a few months down the road. Hopefully in a world of more constructive politics, stuff gets done before before deadline.
Can you talk about the tone in Washington and, I'm sorry, Kaomi gets WSHU. Can you talk about the tone in Washington since you've been back, and if you think this new bipartisanship feeling is going to last?
Well, the tone is, I think, much improved. And the reason for that is that is I think, well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First, a lot of the most aggressive tone on the other side, I think, was encapsulated by something that Senate Republican leader McConnell said shortly after the president was elected, which is our number one political objective is to turn this guy into a one-term president. Well, their number one political objective is now off the table. And so if you're on that side of the aisle, you say to yourself, well, so what am I doing? And I mean, let's face it, the Republican Party received a little bit of a rebuke at the hands of the voters of the United States inasmuch as the Senate remained Democratic and the president was reelected, which a year ago I think was not probably the expected outcome. And so the tone has softened on that side of things. And gratefully, I haven't seen a lot of public gloating or triumphalism on the part of the Democrats. Democrats like me are still conscious of the fact that we're a minority in the House. And so we have no choice but to, if we are to be relevant, but to work with the majority. And those of us that are sort of on the centrist side of the Democratic Party also are excited by the prospect of a more pragmatic Republican Party in the House as a partner with whom to work towards this larger project. So yes, I think the tone is a lot better, but I don't want to overstate that. I mean, it's still a very partisan place, and while I don't want to engage in too much political punditry, I mean, that's not my job, I will say that the partisan issue that matters most in this whole grand math equation that we're talking about is Speaker John Boehner and his relationship with the right wing of his caucus. Inasmuch as he feels like he's got running room, like he's got support, I think he's got what's the right word? He's got running room with the president. But if he feels like the right wing, in whatever form it might take, the Tea Party or Eric Cantor or what have you, has him very circumscribed, if he really thinks that he's going to lose his speakership, this becomes a much more challenging negotiation.
So when do you think you hit the point, if you go past January without the agreement, that you start getting worried about the military spending and what that means for jobs and contracts, or the other impacts, for the programs, like, reach down to, services for seniors, and, when does that really start to put the heat on you? I don't know whether it's been, calculated, it would take a couple of months before you start to see, serious ramifications.
Yeah. Well, let me try to so let's imagine that I'm wrong and that there's actually not an agreement, in place around the new year. And I don't know if around the new year means on January 1st or December 20th, but let's just imagine that, oops, we're going to go through the quote-unquote fiscal cliff. I think the first thing that happens gets back to a question that Ken instigated. The first thing that happens is there's all sorts of perceptual issues. People, markets, investors say, my God, they're not going to get it done. And that could have a significant impact on markets, including the stock market and the bond market. Rates could rise. I think you would start to hear some noise, if you don't hear it already, from the credit rating agencies. I don't think that would affect a downgrade, but it would probably generate threats of a downgrade of the United States' credit. I think that's the first thing that happens if we get through New Year's with no deal in sight. The second thing, and Marty, you said this right, the second thing, this becomes a real problem for the defense contractors, because under something called the WARN Act, they are required to give their employees that they may be laying off advance warning of that layoff. So it's not like, it's not like other corporations that can lay people off at will. It becomes a real problem for the defense contractors. Interestingly enough, you asked about, social programs. many of the critical anti-poverty safety net programs, food stamps, Medicaid, others, are actually firewalled off from these sequestration cuts. So the people who get affected are more the defense contractors and doctors, frankly. On the non-defense side of the automatic cuts is up to 2% cuts in reimbursements for doctors. So they begin to feel the squeeze along with the defense industry. As do, frankly, I mean, now you've got a big management issue too. I mean, FAA, the court system, all of these government agencies that you don't necessarily think of as, first when you think about government spending, need to begin to put plans in place to deal with automatic cuts. So for all those reasons, crossing that line is a bad idea.
You mentioned...
Hi.
Chuck, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Liz. Congressman, hi. Chuck Lewis in Washington.
Hi, Chuck.
First of all, congratulations on the results of 2 weeks ago.
Thank you.
I have a two-part question. One, you seem to be foreseeing what I would call a continuing resolution with a plan attached to it. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yeah, that's a fair summary.
Okay, now, then assuming that to be the case, aren't you kicking the can down the road?
Well, yes and no. And what I mean by that is, if you ask me the question of can the pillars of this deal be done by December 31st, and by the pillars I mean tax code reform, which is more than a 5-week process, Medicare reform, which is certainly more than a 5-week process, negotiation around Social Security, those things simply can't be accomplished in 5 weeks.
Right.
So that leaves you with two options. That says, okay, let's get them done in the, look, I've been doing this for 4 years, but let's say 4 to 6 months that they're going to take, and let's do it while the fiscal cliff, the ineptly named fiscal cliff effects begin to gather steam, or let's move those hammers. Obviously, I would favor moving those hammers with one caveat, which is if you move those hammers once, why not do it again? And then why not do it again? And gosh, isn't, all of a sudden you get used to, as you said, kicking the can down the road. So yes, it is uncomfortable to say it, but unless you believe that we can do, committees of jurisdiction and all of these incredible things that need to be part of this deal, if you think we can do it, or even if you think we should do it, given the lame duck conference before December 31st, some little minor element of deadline moving is probably called for.
Right. Okay. Now, sequestration was inserted after the failure, kicked in after the failure of the 2011 Super Committee to come up with a plan. So a continuing resolution negates sequestration in January, and it puts another target out there of what do you say several months?
Well,
July 1?
I'm speculating, obviously. I mean, on the one hand, these are very, very big things to do. On the other hand, through any number of processes, including the Simpson-Bowles Commission, including proposals like the Rivlin-Domenici proposal, these are, how you do this is something that we're not starting, tabula rasa on. There's been a lot of discussion around it.
Okay, my question is, do you foresee another enforcement mechanism, a chastity belt, like sequestration was designed to be and failed as a threatening mechanism to encourage the Super Committee back in 2011 to come up with a plan? Do you see another enforcement mechanism in the plan that would justify a continuing resolution going into 2013?
There has to be, from my point of view, and I never like to hem myself in, but it's hard for me to imagine that I would vote for a continuing resolution in order to give us time if behind that the same hammers that now are here to motivate a deal didn't also exist. So I think that's maybe the difference between, quote unquote, kicking the can down the road and giving yourself the time to do a very difficult thing prudently. It's whether you simply make the hammers go away or whether you move them, some period of time.
What would be an example of an enforcement mechanism in 2013?
Well, again, I mean, let's just for sake of discussion, let's say that it takes 4 months for the committees of jurisdiction to hammer out the legislative specifics of a grand bargain. I would say move the automatic tax cuts and the automatic spending increases, the sequestration, out 4 months.
So if you keep the sequestration mechanism, you just would delay it.
Again, I don't like to hem myself in, but it's almost inconceivable to me that I would vote for a continuing resolution which eliminated the sequestration cuts or the tax increases. And believe me, it's not that I like any of that stuff. It's just that I'm very aware that without it, Congress may just not act.
Right.
And frankly, to me, that's failure. People say, what does failure look like? Does failure look like the sequestration cuts and the tax cut increases coming into play? I don't actually think that that's what really happens. A much more likely form of failure would be if the Congress just said, gosh, we can't reach a deal, and these tax increases are terrible, and gosh, these cuts are terrible, so we're just going to wave a wand and make them all go away. And, 3 months from now, everything goes away, and we're in a stalemate, and, at some point, the markets speak, and the people speak, and they say, you guys just can't govern yourselves anymore, and there'll be a very severe cost to be paid if that's the path that Congress chooses to take.
Thank you very much.
Did you?
You mentioned some opportunities for failure. Were there any others more than what you've stated already that you could foresee happening that might not allow this to get done by the deadline?
Well, again, I think the deal could be scotched by Senate Democrats, because they're in the majority there. It could be scotched by House Republicans, because they're in the majority in the House. And either of those things could happen. And this is why I'm not saying it's a done deal. This is why I'm saying I think it's probable that we get a deal done. The final deal, we know one thing for sure, is that the left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing of the Republican Party is not going to be at all happy with the final deal. And the only question is, are they so unhappy that they can knock the whole card table over prior to the deal happening? That is a form of failure. The other form of failure is what we just discussed, which is that we just, Congress does the ultimate craven thing and says, geez, this stuff's too hard. We're just gonna make it all go away. And that we'd be punished pretty quickly for doing that. I mean, you'd see downgrades, you'd see rises in U.S. interest rates, and we'd be punished pretty quickly if that was the route that Congress took.
These barriers you speak of, are you talking about politics, or are you talking about anything in specific economic plan or outlook, or what do you see these barriers as?
Well, the barriers are caused by people who go into a negotiation saying, I will not do this. So that I can be bipartisan about this, there's an awful lot of Republicans in the Congress who have said, I will not ever vote for another penny of revenue ever again, no matter what. This is the Norquist pledge. There are Democrats who say, I will not touch Medicare or Social Security in any way, shape, or form. You get 535 people, each with their own things that they will not touch in any way, shape, or form. You've got a recipe for a failed negotiation, which is why I've tried to sort of maintain the attitude of, look, there's lots of stuff in what we do that I care a lot about. I was meeting with a constituent earlier today on the value of the deductibility of philanthropic contributions, right? You get a tax deduction for making a philanthropic contribution. If that gets capped or eliminated, though it wouldn't be eliminated, fewer hospitals get funded, universities see their giving go down, the United Way. That's not a good thing. I really don't want that to happen, but I'm also, because I'm aware of what a successful process looks like, as I told my constituent, I said, look, I'm with you on this, but I'm not going to say under no circumstances can this be talked about, because that's, again, if enough of us come at the table with that attitude, we fail.
Can you share with us what you think would be a likely agreement?
Well, I'm fond of saying that it is something that looks like the Simpson-Bowles proposal or the Domenici-Rivlin proposals. These were comprehensive deals that were hammered out. And I'm not fond of saying it because I love those deals. There's things in Simpson-Bowles that I like and things that I don't like. I'm fond of saying it just because those are the only proposals, and in particular the Simpson-Bowles proposal is the only one that has received vocal bipartisan support. So you had, remember Simpson-Bowles came out of the President's Debt Reduction Commission. When they put that on the table, Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, who's as conservative as they come, and Dick Durbin of Illinois, he was a pretty liberal guy, they both voted for it. So you look at that and you say, hey, you got at least the outlines of the deal here.
But as you say, you were one of only a handful of Democrats who voted for it, so a similar agreement. So what do you think? Does that mean members of your own party are going to have to move the goalposts a little for themselves?
Well, this is partly important. This is partly why this can't happen in the lame duck, right? I mean, Congress needs to feel like it had an opportunity to negotiate, and it should. This isn't something that should be done behind closed doors with 3 people or 4 people or 6 people even. A guy like me feels like he wants an opportunity to articulate why it's important to maintain the deductibility of charitable contributions or whatever it is that's your personal. When the Simpson-Bowles budget was on the floor of the House, it got 38 votes, 22 Democrats, 16 Republicans. That's pretty poor showing, except for the fact that it was both parties. And what I will tell you is that there are an awful lot of people of both parties who will vote for something like that when it quote unquote matters, and in other words, when it is the deal and not just something that your primary opponent or your opponent in a general election can use to beat you around the ears. But it's going to be tough political work. John Boehner is going to put his speakership at risk to get this deal done, and you will undoubtedly hear bickering within the Democratic Party about what the President and Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi ultimately agree with. It's going to be tough.
How far are you personally willing to go when it comes to Social Security and Medicare? Because I think that's where a lot of the concern from Democrats, from seniors, from people who are about to be seniors have with this kind of grand bargain that gives away too much and it's going to impact those kinds of benefits. Where's your line in the sand on that?
Well, my personal line in the sand on this is that on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, we can't harm the least advantaged Americans. I don't know how, and maybe this is a statement of political values or something else, but I don't know how, after a period of, let's call it 14 years, of spending an immense amount of money on a couple of wars, on reducing our tax rates in a way that dramatically benefited the wealthiest people in this country. I don't know how you then look yourself in the mirror and say, and by the way, I'm voting for a Social Security plan that is going to force a lot of senior citizens into poverty. So my personal line in the sand is that we don't reform those programs in a way that hurts the most vulnerable. Now, that doesn't mean you can't reform those programs, right? I mean, remember, every American senior citizen, rich and poor, is a beneficiary of Medicare and of Social Security. So you've got ample room. It's not easy, but you've got ample room to restructure those programs to truly provide a base level of insurance for people, but that maybe ask our richest seniors to pay a little more or to have other alternatives, but that don't damage the folks who rely on that to not be in poverty.
Talk about Speaker Boehner potentially putting his speakership at risk. Last week, Nancy Pelosi said she would stand again for Minority Leader. Do you feel she's the right person to lead the Democrats, and are you going to vote in favor of her when the new Congress comes in?
You mean vote in favor of her for Speaker?
Well, I mean for Minority Leader.
In the rather ceremonial vote?
Yeah.
Well, the vote that we take that is public in the House is a vote for Speaker of the House, and I imagine that if my choices are between Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner, I will vote for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House. First of all, I think it was inevitable. To me, it was inconceivable that Nancy Pelosi, after all that she has done and become, that she was going to voluntarily sort of step away from what is probably one of the most consequential negotiations that Washington will do in this generation. People who are saying she's going to step down, no way. Secondly, from a negotiation standpoint, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party puts a huge amount of faith in her. And that's an important fact in getting a deal done. I mean, let's just play this out. Let's imagine that, the other alternative to Nancy Pelosi would have been Steny Hoyer being the Democratic leader. He would be brand new. He wouldn't have a track record. Within the caucus, there would probably be a lot more concern about exactly what he was going to do in those negotiations, whereas the left wing of the Democratic Party, I think, feels very, very, frankly, the Democratic Party generally feels pretty comfortable with her being in those negotiations. Now remember, she's in the minority, right? The key dynamic in these negotiations is between the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House right now.
I'm wondering, it's kind of a little bit off, it's off this topic, but it may very well come to some type of head while you're in this session, is the situation going on now in Israel and Gaza. And basically, with the way the cards are playing out, what might, would there be anything that would instigate, a military intervention there? With Egypt asking now for the U.S. to put a stop to the assault on Gaza. I'm wondering, is there? I mean, something could happen in the next 4 weeks that might interfere with this fiscal cliff, negotiation, and we'll have to break off and start talking about something foreign policy wise.
Yeah, well, we really don't have because of the quote-unquote fiscal cliff, we really don't have the room to simply sideline that discussion. So I think that discussion happens, regardless. But you do raise an important question, which is, if there's increasing instability in the Middle East generally, because it's not just the, unfortunate violence in Israel, Gaza. It's also, we haven't talked about it lately, but it's still there, Iran and their development of nuclear weapons. But the former, you asked about military intervention. It's inconceivable to me to imagine that there is a scenario that requires U.S. military intervention in Israel or in Gaza. I think the world is speaking more or less with one voice, which is that we hope that both sides can stand down from escalation. Look, Israel's got a right to defend itself, and Israel sat for weeks while Gaza was a launching pad for missile attack after missile attack after rocket attack after rocket attack. And that seems like a long way away from here, but if the southern United States were being subjected to that kind of violence out of Mexico, we would do something about it. And so Israel has a right to defend itself. They have a right to not be constantly attacked from Gaza, and the Gazans have got to accept that. In the meantime, there's been loss of life on both sides, and I think I speak for most people in the government when I say that we'd love to see a ceasefire. We'd love to see the level of violence reverse rather than escalate.
Getting back to economics, do you see any stimulus packages or anything in the horizon, or something that boosts the economy, get it going, or do you see it moving in the right direction?
Well, I would advocate for, and I'd love to see something that I've been talking about for a long time, representing as I do this area of the world, which is, a real commitment to infrastructure investment. It's one of those things where, it's sort of hard to argue with, right? Around this country, our airports, our railways, by the way, our power lines, as we all experienced, our networks and whatnot, these things need to be improved. We're going to do it. We're going to spend the money. We're not going to argue about whether bridges should fall down or whether airports should be closed, right? We're going to do it. So why not do it now? Interest rates are pretty much zero for the United States government. We got all kinds of out-of-work steel workers and operating engineers and laborers and whatnot who would love to go to work. So again, if I was the only guy in the room, I would say, look, we're going to spend this money. Let's put together a mechanism to actually rebuild our infrastructure. But whether that's going to be part of the broader package or not, I don't know. But we'll have another bite at that apple.
That was my follow-up. Do you have anything in works on your end that you want to propose or cut, or, where do you see yourself?
Well, I've been a supporter of the National Infrastructure Bank, right? So this is an idea that that says we ought to invest in our infrastructure more wisely than we have in the past. We ought to take more of the politics out of it. We ought to create a bank that mingles, government money with private sector money to address this multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure problem we have. So that doesn't necessarily need to be done as part of the grand bargain, but it's something I'd love to see get done. Particularly this area of the world, our economies are going to be partly related to the extent to which we invest in our highways and our railways and that sort of thing.
What about cuts on your end? What do you see that you'd like to see cut or eliminated, or,
Well, so to my way of thinking, the two biggest areas where we can look for savings, and you asked about cuts, you didn't ask about taxes, you asked about cuts. The two biggest areas happen to be the two biggest areas of outlay for the federal government. Defense, which when you take Pentagon plus Homeland Security, CIA, intelligence, and war, is $800 billion. That's roughly a quarter of what we put out the door, outlays. It also happens to be more money than every other country on the planet combined spends on those things. And remember, a lot of those countries are our friends. You look at the chart of spending, it's, the U.S. is up here and everybody else is down here. And so what do you do? And I want to get to the second area too, but you say, okay, don't take it from me, by the way, General Jim Jones, my Republican opponent in this last election, who was a Navy officer, as he put it, he said, you walk into the Pentagon, you can smell the waste, right? You got a lot of efficiencies you can find there. You can also think more creatively about how we're configured. We're basically now militarily configured to do just about anything, anywhere, including, by the way, fight the Soviet Union in the plains of Germany, right? Which I don't think we're going to do anytime soon. So sort of accelerating a modernization and a more optimal use of money in defense is really critical. And by the way, it's easy for a guy like me to point at the Pentagon and say they're full of waste and they're not configured correctly. We're a big part of the problem. And what I mean by that is that, there's nothing that the Pentagon doesn't make that isn't made across 20 congressional districts. And the members involved will go to the mat to keep making whatever it is, regardless of whether it's useful for our defense, and that's, something that we should grapple with. So, defense, in virtue of its size, is one. The other area happens to be the other huge the other big fiscal challenge we've got, which is back to healthcare. The projected curve of Medicare spending, we have got to get that under control. And you say, well, how do you do that? It's a very lengthy discussion, but one fact to bear in mind when you say, oh, do we need to hurt people? Do we need to reduce the quality of the care they receive? Right? We spend 2 times what any other industrialized country, not any other, what the average of other industrialized countries spend on individual health care, and our results are worse. That's the definition of inefficiency. So changing that model gives us the opportunity to find a lot of savings without actually hurting anyone.
I asked that because Connecticut just had a record tax increase, and we're still $365 million deficit. And it's not that we have a revenue problem; we have a spending problem. So,
Yeah, I sort of object to, that's a very Republican way of putting it. We don't have a revenue problem; we got a spending problem. When you say that, what you're saying is, I don't like the level of spending we have today, and I like the level of taxation. Well, that's right, there's two factors in this equation, money in and money out, right? And you can tinker with both, and our society ought to struggle with what the right level of services is. The piece of this that we didn't mention, though, which is really important, and it should be mentioned up front, and it's part of the reason that Connecticut has such a big budget gap, and part of the reason the federal government does, is we need more economic growth, right? A lot of these problems go away if you're growing faster than we're growing today. So there's a whole other discussion to be had that we haven't really talked a lot about today about how do you accelerate economic growth? You do that and a lot of your problems go away. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
And what's your plans for Thanksgiving?
I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying at home and eating turkey.
And when does Congress go back into session? Is it the Monday after Thanksgiving?
It's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, and as the majority leader said, or not majority, that was an aspirational statement, as the minority whip said the other day, don't make plans before New Year's. So I think we'll probably be down there pretty solid working on this stuff until the end of the year.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Twinkie Bella?
Yeah, what is this? We bail out the investment banks, but not
Friends
houses?
to take care of it.
That's important.